My question to you is this. Is Zelensky's proposal for peace an admission of failure? Is Zelensky's proposal for peace an admission of failure? 0345 6060 973, text 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Joining me to discuss this is Leigh Turner, former British ambassador to Ukraine from 2008 to 2012, and author of Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties. Thank you very much indeed for joining me, Mr. Turner. It's all over, isn't it?
Afternoon, Ali. Yeah, I was interested to hear your reading the headline in The Telegraph, which of course isn't what Zelensky said at all. What Zelensky has basically said is that give us NATO membership, give Ukraine NATO membership, and don't compromise on the principle of Ukraine's internationally recognized legal borders. That could be the basis for a deal. But this is a really significant shift. You're right, that Zelensky now is talking about talks with Russia. And my take on this is that it's a considered intervention from Zelensky to prepare the ground for a President Trump who's coming in on the 25th of January, remember, and a likely push from Trump and pressure from Trump to have discussions with Russia and to reach a deal of some kind. So Zelensky is trying to sketch out some red lines. I wonder also whether he may even be trying to make it look a bit more like a Russian victory, because, of course, if we're going to have a deal, we have to have a deal that's acceptable to both sides. And Putin has lost, by various estimates, up to 600,000 people killed and seriously injured. He can't walk away from this without it looking like a victory for Russia. And at the same time, Zelensky can't give up Ukrainian land permanently. There's an important adjective in there that you put in when you were reading out the Telegraph report as a whole that talked about temporarily giving up land and trying to negotiate to get it back. So we're in quite a new situation, and I would confidently predict that we will get a very hardline response from Russia. Also trying to set out its red lines. They will say there can be no question of NATO membership for Ukraine. They've been saying that from the start. They've been trying to stop it from happening. They will make maximalist demands about territory and so on. And so we will see a negotiation perhaps begin. And the key question in all this will be, whatever happens, what kind of security guarantees is Ukraine going to get?
Do you think it's at all realistic that Ukraine is going to be given NATO membership? We know that carrot has been dangled for years, has never come to pass. And I suspect it's never come to pass for good reason, that the West doesn't want to spill Western blood in defence of Ukraine. I mean, that's the reality, isn't it?
Back in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, the question of NATO membership for Ukraine was discussed. That was the last time, actually, it was seriously discussed. And NATO said, no, you can't become a member of NATO, sorry, because some countries, notably France and Germany, were dead against it, and they thought it might provoke Russia. Unfortunately, attempts not to provoke Russia have been completely unsuccessful, and despite NATO membership being ruled out in 2008, Russia still attacked in 2014 and again in 2022. So I wouldn't say never, but it's going to be a very big ask to get NATO membership for Ukraine.
Indeed, you say it's going to be a big ask, and it is, because all 32 NATO member countries need to agree to it. We know that President Trump isn't the biggest fan of NATO. He's chastised NATO, a lot of NATO states, for not spending the 2.5% on GDP, thinks they're basking under the American security umbrella. So the backdrop is not exactly great. What does this mean for the West? If Zelensky has clocked, and he's a comedian, but he's an astute comedian, that basically the game's up with Trump coming into the White House. He hasn't got what he wanted when he wanted it, even with Biden there, because he wanted certain weapons at certain points, haven't come, all come rather late. If he's clocked it, what does this mean for the West? It's a humiliation, is it not?
Well, I think you've got to be careful about who you're calling a comedian amongst top politicians, actually, there, Ali. There's a lot of comedians we could...
That's a good point.
But I mean, let's look at this. You're absolutely right that the advent of Trump changes everything. So we're going to get a lot of pressure for a deal. Now, that doesn't mean there's going to be a deal. We've seen Trump, when he was last president, claiming that he would rapidly get a deal on the Korean Peninsula and giving the North Korean leader all kinds of goodies and sweeteners to try and get him to agree a deal. in the end, nothing happened whatsoever. But what we do see is we're coming down towards the possibility of some negotiations taking place, which hasn't really happened since 2022. So that's very significant. Personally, I would have thought that the West, if we include the US, NATO, UK, EU, would have done better to support Ukraine more strongly earlier. I remember having a discussion with none other than Boris Johnson back in 2016 when I was ambassador in Vienna about whether we should arm Ukraine to the teeth. That was what I was arguing back in 2016.
So was he, wasn't he? When he got it, he was arguing the same thing, wasn't he?
Well, he was at that point foreign secretary.
Yes, of course.
And unfortunately, when at that point the consensus amongst Western forces was we didn't want to provoke Russia by providing tanks or guided missiles or anything offensive. In my view, with hindsight, it's easy to be wise in hindsight. That was a mistake, and it would be better for the UK, US, Germany, France, etc., to provide Ukraine with more weapons so that their negotiating position will be stronger. Because the key question when negotiations will start will be how much land does each side have, and what is the best negotiated settlement they can get, if indeed there is any landing zone, because it is not clear at all that there's a landing zone.
Final question.
Putin wants these four regions to be recognized as part of Russia. He doesn't want NATO membership. Those two things are it's very hard to see how they can both sides can agree.
Well, you've kind of sort of answered my last question I was going to ask already, because that was the point I was going to make. If one of the rationales for Putin doing this in the first place was he didn't want NATO bumping up against his border, irrespective of if there's a frozen conflict or not, he's not going to be really willing to have NATO still on his border with the rest of Ukraine that is going to come under the NATO umbrella. Simply, the landing zone, as you say, is going to be very difficult to work out. Thank you very much indeed. That was Leigh Turner, former British ambassador to Ukraine, 2008 to 2012, author of Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties. Always very considered on these matters.